Some, testing him, asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of dismissal and to divorce her." But Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote this commandment for you. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Then, in the house, the disciples asked him again about this matter. He said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." In the ancient world, there was a popular kind of story called a challenge riposte. In this kind of tale, you have a wise master, philosopher, or teacher who is presented with a challenging question. The kind of question that is dangerous to answer because, no matter what they say, they are likely to get in trouble or be shamed in front of others. But somehow, the wise teacher is able to answer the question in a completely unexpected way that skirts the danger and perhaps even turns the tables on the questioners. There are a number of these sorts of stories in the Gospels. The most memorable example is probably the question about paying taxes. The people who asked Jesus whether it was lawful to pay the tax to the emperor thought that they had him trapped. No matter what he said, he would lose. If he said that the people should pay the tax, which was deeply unpopular, he would have lost honor and standing with the people. And in that culture, honor meant everything. But if he said not to pay, well, that was treason, and that would make the Romans shut him down even faster. That story puts Jesus into a tight spot, and he has to demonstrate his wit and wisdom by using humor, as I argued in my episode 6.10, Jesus' coin trick, to get out of it. He demonstrates that, having no coins himself, the question actually has nothing to do with him. And then, of course, he ends with one of his most memorable sayings, which essentially turns the onus of the question back on his questioners. So, it's not hard to see how the tax question is a perfect example of a challenge riposte story. And the question about divorce follows exactly the same pattern. It is clearly meant to be read as the same kind of tale. But I have a question. What is it about this divorce question that makes it so perilous for Jesus to answer it? Of course, it is true that the question of divorce could sometimes be contentious in Jewish society at the time. Rabbis did argue over their interpretation of this particular law for ages. But that doesn't necessarily make it a dangerous question. Jews have always loved arguing over their scriptures. It is one of the things that makes them good Jews. So where was the danger in Jesus answering this question in one way or the other? How could his personal honor or safety have been at risk if he gave his thoughts on divorce? I don't see it. So, is this just a bad example of a challenge riposte story? Or is there something else going on in this story that we are unaware of? Well, it turns out that there is. And there is quite the story there. This is Retelling the Bible. Episode 9.3. The question that could have gotten Jesus killed. Herod Antipas, the ruler of Galilee and Perea, had a problem. And that problem was named Fazael. She was his wife. And don't get me wrong, she was a nice enough wife. Herod didn't have anything against her as a person, but she had become a bit of a stumbling block to his ambitions. Herod was the son, one of a number of sons of Herod the Great. He personally believed that he was just as great as his father had ever been. And yet, here he was ruling over a territory less than a quarter of the size of his father's kingdom. In fact, the Romans wouldn't even let him call it a kingdom. They called it a tetrarchy. Herod felt as if he deserved so much more, and he knew that his wife was one of the things that was holding him back. You see, she was a Nabatean, the daughter, in fact, of King Aretas IV of Nabatea. And if Herod Antipas wanted to have a real kingdom, a Nabatean princess was just not good enough. He needed a wife who could connect him to the only living Jewish dynasty, the Hasmonean royal family. And there was basically only one person left alive from that family who fit the bill. Herod family reunions were kind of confusing, to say the least. It seemed as if half of the men who came were named Herod, and half of the women were named Mariamne. It was a tangled web of half-siblings and uncles who had married their nieces and cousins. You practically needed a map of the family tree in your hand just to make small talk. But there was one person that everyone knew who she was, because she was one of the only living descendants of Herod the Great's second wife, Mariamne. And Mariamne was the last princess of the once great dynasty of the Hasmoneans, considered by many to be the only true ruling dynasty of Judea. Her name was Herodias, and whoever was married to her might just be able to aspire to be as great as, well, the Great One. But Herodias had been married off to one of the least ambitious sons of Herod, the one that they called Herod Jr. Herodias liked her husband well enough as a person, but she aspired to be more. She aspired to be a queen as great as her grandmother had been, and she felt as if her marriage was holding her back. Once, when Herod Antipas was traveling, he just happened to stay with his half-brother, Herod Jr. And while her husband was busy with matters of state, Herodias played the gracious hostess to her brother-in-law / half-uncle. They got along quite well, and soon found themselves off in some quiet corner of the house, drinking wine and commiserating over how they felt as if their ambitions were being thwarted. After they had shared a few cups together, Herodias decided that the two of them ought to take action. "Here is what we should do," she said. "If you just divorce your wife, and I divorce my useless husband, we could marry each other. That would make us the greatest power couple Judea has ever seen. Nothing could stop us." Antipas gave it a few moments' thought. He was no expert, but as far as his wine-addled brain could remember, the Jewish law did permit divorce. Surely nothing could go wrong with such an extraordinary plan. King Aretas IV of Nabatea was not the kind of man who took something like his son-in-law divorcing his daughter and sending her home in disgrace, lying down. So, how did he react when Herod Antipas rejected Phasael? Did he send him a sternly worded letter of complaint? Did he initiate some kind of legal action? No, he was not the kind of man for an understated reaction. Aretas gathered his army and prepared a full-scale invasion of Antipas's territory. And, to add insult to injury, he even got another member of the Herod clan, the one known as Philip, to join in the fight. Herod Antipas, for some reason, was completely caught off guard and embarrassingly defeated. He even had to appeal to the Roman emperor to lend him imperial troops just to get his revenge. So, this brilliant plan of Antipas and Herodias divorcing and then marrying each other was not really looking quite so brilliant anymore. More than anything, it had made Antipas a laughingstock throughout the entire region. Antipas would have really liked it if everyone forgot about the whole divorce drama and let him and his hot, dynastically connected new wife get on with their lives. But do you suppose that is what happened? Of course not. People kept talking about the divorce, and everyone seemed to have an opinion. Most of the opinions were very negative, and so you can imagine that Antipas very much wanted to shut down all discussion. But he couldn't do it. There was one man who was particularly annoying. His name was John, but people called him the Dipper because of his habit of dipping people into the waters of the Jordan River. He had set himself up beyond the Jordan, in Perea, where he gathered a pack of radicals and stirred them up against their king. Worst of all, he openly declared that Antipas's marriage was wicked because both he and Herodias had divorced their spouses, and because Herod was married to his still living brother's ex-wife. This, as far as both Herodias and Antipas were concerned, was completely unacceptable. In another ill-considered action, Herod had this John arrested and imprisoned in the fortress of Machaerus. When that didn't settle people down, he had him executed sometime later. Herod Antipas had unfortunately never heard of the Streisand effect. His ham-fisted attempt to shut down all talk about his marriage only served to make the public even more aware of what he had done. Soon everyone everywhere was talking about it. It became a primary topic of conversation in every marketplace, synagogue, and tavern throughout the land. Anyone who had a reputation as a teacher or authority could not avoid the question. In fact, the topic became so ubiquitous that you didn't even need to spell it out. If somebody asked you, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" you knew immediately which man they were talking about. It was not a generic question that was asking about all divorces for all time. It was very much a question of the moment. It was also a very dangerous question. No one knew who Antipas might target next for answering it in the wrong way. He'd murdered before. Surely he wouldn't hesitate to murder again. When a group of Pharisees came up to Jesus to ask the question, the entire crowd that was there that day immediately fell silent. No one needed to tell them that what Jesus said next mattered enormously. If Jesus just said that a man could divorce his wife for any reason, people would immediately understand that he didn't have a problem with Antipas's choice to abandon Phasael for no better reason than his insatiable political ambition. The crowds would disperse almost immediately. But if, On the other hand, he dared to criticize Herod and Herodias. The people might cheer, but they all knew what had happened to John, and they would certainly disappear when the soldiers came to take Jesus away to the Machaerus. If the crowd was aware of the danger of the moment, Jesus was no less aware. He answered, but nowhere in his words could anyone possibly accuse him of giving a controversial opinion. Instead, he appealed only to the traditions of Moses and the law, directing everyone to what the Scriptures said. Not even Herod would be able to arrest Jesus for that. Jesus' friends clearly understood why he had answered the way that he had, but they could barely contain their curiosity about what Jesus really thought about the whole affair. And so, as soon as they got him alone, they began to interrogate him. What about the insult that Herod gave to his father-in-law, Aretas? Don't you think that God was punishing him with that terrible defeat? One asked. And don't you think that Antipas did a terrible thing to his brother? But Jesus did not answer like they expected. Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her, he replied. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery. That puzzled them, because they had never considered that you even could commit adultery against a woman? For them, for everyone, adultery was something that you did to a man when you took away the woman that belonged to him without his permission. Women were property. How could you commit theft against someone who didn't own anything? That was one that they would have to ponder for a while. Jesus had a way of doing that, of making people see things in ways that they never had before. Everyone had been talking about Herod Antipas's offensive political act and taking much schadenfreude from his humiliation. Jesus seemed to be suggesting that they ought to think of those who had been personally wounded by the whole affair. It was, to say the least, a rather radical thing to say. Do you think it is acceptable for a man to have an affair with a porn star while his wife is recovering from having a baby, and for him to pay her $130,000 to not talk about it? If that question were asked of a political or religious leader today, would it be considered just a general question, applicable to any situation where a man had sex with a porn star? Of course not. Everyone would know exactly what man and what wife and what porn star was being discussed. There would be no need for names. Everyone would just understand. Well, I would suggest that in the early 1st century in Galilee, The divorce question was a similar kind of question. Were there other cases of divorce that scandalized various communities spread throughout the Galilean hills? Of course there were. But those divorces would have had little impact beyond the families and local communities affected. But there were absolutely 2 divorces and 1 subsequent marriage that affected everybody in that region. And it had been made clear to everyone that they had better not criticize anything about the whole situation. So I am pretty sure that when the Pharisees asked the question of Jesus, everyone's thoughts turned to Antipas and Herodias. People often use this passage in the Bible to make very generalized statements. They say that Jesus was giving a restrictive definition of marriage, specifically the marriage of 1 male and 1 female for life. But Jesus is not here concerned with offering definitions in this passage. We also use this passage to make general statements about the acceptability of divorce in all circumstances, when Jesus seems to have been talking about 1 circumstance. When pressed by his disciples, Jesus certainly expressed concern about divorce, particularly for those who are hurt or wounded by it. He even included the radical idea that women could actually be sinned against, an idea that likely left his disciples scratching their heads. But I do not hear him pronouncing a blanket condemnation against all divorce, in all circumstances, from on high. This is not a story told to pronounce eternal truths about all marriages and all divorces. This is a challenge riposte story, and the question being asked was indeed very perilous for Jesus to answer. But to see that, you need to hear the story behind it. And, well, that is what I am here for. That is it for this episode of Retelling the Bible. Please subscribe so you can get the next regular episode in 2 weeks' time. The theme music for the podcast is Ada by Kevin MacLeod, and the mood music for this episode was The Bees by Sasha End. The music is licensed in the Creative Commons and can be found at incompetech.com and at filmmusic.io, respectively. You can contact me on Bluesky at Retelling the Bible, on the Facebook page Retelling the Bible. Show notes for this episode have been posted at retellingthebible.wordpress.com. Thanks again to my Patreon supporters. Go to patreon.com/retellingthebible to support this podcast. This is Retelling the Bible, and I have been your storyteller, W. Scott McCandless.